Dundee residents had their chance to sound off tonight.
Some are upset about how the city is planning to convert Farnam Street to that often talked about two-way all-day plan.
6 News' Bella Correcta talked to residents and community leaders at a community meeting tonight about the plan and what they don't like about it.
If you're driving on Farnam Street, something you have to keep in mind are these signs and these signals of whether to go or not to go. Well, the city of Omaha is trying to change that and make it a little bit safer and less confusing. But the people who live nearby aren't too happy with the solution.
Everybody in the neighborhood will tell you that there are wrong way drivers on Farnam Street every day. It's incredibly dangerous. We're happy that the city is doing something to address the safety. Their something is just different than what we are advocating for.
That's something. Roundabouts. The city is moving forward with an engineering study's recommendation to install roundabouts at the 50th and 52nd intersections of Farnam. The city argues it would address red light running crashes and slow down traffic. But critics at the Dundee Neighborhood Association meeting were vocal about not wanting them. Jim Elliston lives on the corner of 52nd and Farnam.
How much of the property the roundabout would take? How close would traffic come to our house?
Other concerns were raised that go beyond the 8 properties that touch the 2 intersections. Cost and safety of pedestrians. Kids often can be found walking home from school in that area. Instead, many at the meeting advocated for a 2-way, all-day pilot program without constructing roundabouts. Although that doesn't seem to be in the cards. Mayor Stothert stood her ground. In an email she wrote in part, roundabouts are the safest option and the only option that will be considered.
Given the ultimatum by the mayor, we're either going to have roundabouts or do nothing. I believe that the best decision is to do nothing.
The city council's power in all this comes at the design phase and then again at the construction contracts phase. At those points, they can vote yes or no to move forward. On your side in Omaha, Bella Correcta, 6 News.
If the project goes through, the mayor says construction would take 3 months beginning in 2024 at the earliest.